All right, so first of all, we were up here noticing that this looks a lot like one of our undergraduate classes in that there's like 3 rows of nearly empty seats and everybody's in the back. I'm surprised I don't see somebody with a hat backwards, like texting their friend or something. There's lots of room up here, so please feel free to move up. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
There you go.
Teacher's pet. So I know, yeah, John, you would be the one, John, who texting your friend in the back. So thank you, first of all, to everybody for coming out. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Perot. I'm the current chair of the department. For those of you who have a long history in the department, it's now the Department of Geography and the Environment. The department has been changing. This is, I guess the second year that we've been known by that name. So the department's a little bit in transition. So hopefully those of you with a long history have an opportunity to get to know people and get to know kind of the things that have been happening in this building. But this isn't so much about the future of the department today as it is about the history and the legacy of Don Meynick, who was an enormously important figure in the history of our department and in the history of the discipline. And I want to acknowledge Don's family members that are here, so thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience in the long delay. Those of you who are familiar with this know that Don passed in 2020, but it was in the midst of the pandemic, and obviously we were not able to get together in person last year, or 2 years ago. We had to put it off again last year because of Delta, and we're grateful that we're able to meet again now, even though there's another, Omicron, Beta, whatever, coming our way. And in fact, our numbers are a little thinner than they would be because we have Bob Wilson, who did the heavy lifting for this event, did by far the majority of that, was tested positive just a couple days ago. He feels okay, but obviously he can't be here, so he's at home. And so anyway, we're grateful for the opportunity, even with reduced numbers, to be in person, to celebrate, and to honor and to remember today. Before we get started, I'd like to just acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee people, on whose ancestral territory we all are and on which Syracuse University stands. I would also like to let everybody know a little bit about today's program. We have the panel. We're going to begin with Jamie, the Associate Provost for Academic Affairs.
Faculty Affairs. Faculty Affairs. My once and future boss.
Let's just put it at that. So we're going to start with Jamie, and then we'll go to Bill Wyckoff, and then let's go to the end of the table to Ann Knowles, and then to Craig Colton, and then we'll wrap up with Rich Shine. So we'll go in that order, if that's okay. We have lots of time. So the presentations, discussion, comments will be about 10 to 15 minutes, in that range, and then we'll have some time for discussion and questions and stuff afterwards. After the panel discussion, I'd like to just remind everybody that we have a reception down the hall, just over in the Strasser Commons, which is just outside the Dean's office, where Eggers Hall and Maxwell Hall meet. So if you go out these doors, turn to the right, and it's just sort of at the end of the hall over there. We'll be all set up. You'll see where that is. So we'll have some hors d'oeuvres. We'll have some drinks if you want to have some alcoholic and non-alcoholic. And then some folks are going to stay, and we're going to have some dinner a little bit later in the founder's room. So that'll be after that. With no further ado, I'm going to turn things back over to Professor Winder. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for showing up.
Okay.
So thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to see everybody in person, and it's great to see so many people who are connected to Don in all sorts of ways. So once I saw the panel, I said to Tom, look, I want to go first, because if you're the first, you don't have to be the best. And in relation to this panel, it's much better to go first than to have to follow any of them. So thanks for letting me go first. But so Don Meinig was really a foundational part of my introduction to geography. And then I was lucky enough to be a faculty member in the department that he so profoundly shaped. I'm also part of Don's scholarly legacy, since my undergraduate and doctoral supervisor, Rich Shine, I'll talk about him in a minute, was one of Don Meinig's students. So I see Don's influence in so many aspects of my scholarly trajectory, and I'll highlight just a few. So I'll start with some of Don's accomplishments that many of us know really well. So he completed his PhD in geography at the University of Washington in 1953, and he came to Syracuse after a few years at the University of Utah in 1959. So from 1968 to 1973, he chaired our department, and I think he was pretty open about the fact that those were not his favorite years. In 1973, he was named a Maxwell Professor of Geography, and in 1990, he was appointed a Maxwell Research Professor. So as best I can tell, as Don got more and more awesome, Maxwell had to keep coming up with new titles to give to him. And he basically received every award a geographer can get. He had Fulbright and Guggenheim fellowships. He had NEH funding. In '86, he won the Charles P. Daly Medal from the American Geographical Society. That same year, he won the Master Teacher Award from the National Council on Geographic Education. In 1991, he was the first U.S.-born geographer to be elected a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. In 2010, he was awarded the rare honor of being named a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. You know, and one of the things that I really appreciated most about Don's work is that his research is both deep and wide in its examination of American landscapes and the cultural and the social and political and economic processes that shaped them. We're going to hear about, he published a number of highly influential works, his 1979 classic, The Interpretation of Ordinary Landscapes, his 4-volume, The Shaping of America, A Geographical Perspective on 500 Years of History, published by Yale. So Don's influence on me as a scholar really began when I was an undergrad. So Carl Raetz, who is a well-known cultural geographer and who, like Don, is a student of the American landscape, assigned Don's work in his own class on American landscapes, which I took as an undergrad. But it's really Don's multi-volume set that holds a really special place in my heart. And some of you have heard me tell this story before, but it's true. So when I decided to declare geography as a major in 1996, I was like 9 at the time. My supervisor, Rich Shine, told me that before I could declare a geography major, and I want to point out geography is a major that needs students, right? So before he would let me declare a geography major, he said I had to read 5 books. So I had to read the 3 volumes that were in existence at that time of The Shaping of America. I had to read Mike Davis's City of Quartz, and I had to read Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. Now, in retrospect, it was obvious that Rich was trying to keep me out of his office. But nonetheless, I did read all 5 of those books, and reading Don's really rich prose on how the American landscape came to be, how it changed, what it meant, and why a deep understanding of landscape is so important, really showed me what cultural and historical geography can be at its best. And it also showed me, as it's done for many people, and this is something that Bob Wilson really takes to heart in his teaching, is why writing is an important craft, how words matter, what a commitment to narrative and defining that compelling story through empirical material, why that's also important to geographic scholarship. I think the other thing that Rich Shine's hazing did of pairing Don's work with Mike Davis and Judith Butler is it also set me on a scholarly course of linking theory and synthesis, of linking theory and empirics, of connecting critical engagement with ideas, and deep engagements with places, histories, and peoples. And I think it really showed the value of big ideas, whether about carceral cities, performativity, or the making of landscape, and about attention to detail. I think the other thing I always appreciated about Don is that he charted his own path. So when most of our discipline committed to writing short articles, Don wrote multiple long books. When cultural geography in particular took various twists and turns through different theoretical perspectives and debates, Don oriented toward an interdisciplinary group of scholars in landscape study and history and other fields. He followed where his research led him, and that takes courage as a scholar. So to let me get on my soapbox for a few minutes about geography, I think we as a discipline would do really well to hold tight to that pairing that the work of Don Meinig makes possible. That critical engagement and theory are so very important, but so are narratives, so are deep engagements with place, and so is really approaching writing as a craft. And I think we lose these things as a discipline at our peril. And so I think Don's work reminds us that we as a discipline need to make and hold space for this kind of scholarly engagement. Now, I also got to know Don through my time at Syracuse, and our department began the Don Meinig undergraduate lecture series in 2013, really as a way to do two things. And the first was to honor Don Meinig's 5 decades of commitment and service to our department, and in particular his work with undergrads. When I was chair, I heard over and over from alums about the profound influence his lectures had on them, and that was just a recurring theme for undergrads who'd worked with him. And then we wanted to use that event really to celebrate the accomplishments of our graduating seniors, and I shamelessly stole this idea for starting something like the Don Meinig undergraduate lecture from the University of Kentucky, which has its own annual lecture that creates an opportunity that links current students, alums, faculty at a yearly celebration of the department. And so my hope when we started this event was that the Don Meinig event would do the same on a long enough timeline. And here we are now in the room with current students, with our faculty, with retired faculty, with alums. So it feels as if it's come full circle. So Don attended several of these lectures, and one of the things I enjoyed most was watching him interact with our undergrads who were just in awe of Don and his work. The other important thing is that our graduating seniors always picked the speaker, who included David Harvey, Sally Marston, Rich Shine, Ann Knowles, Craig Colton. Basically, our whole panel came at one point. We only had to say no to the students once when they asked if we could bring in Anthony Bourdain, and we said, well, if we do, nobody gets paid this year. It's the only way we could afford him. So these lectures have become a really important tradition in our department, and they're continuing the legacy of Don's work. So let me close by reflecting on Don as a friend. So in his later years, while I was chair, Don was kind enough to have lunch with me a few times each semester. And so I'll always remember his love of sandwich shops in Syracuse, and the fact that he always took half the sandwich home. I'll always remember the fact that every time I went to see Don, he had a newspaper article for me about something he knew that was important to me, whether it was where I grew up or horses or something else he knew that I cared about. He was such an avid reader, and Don was always on the lookout for something that a friend might also enjoy. I'll also remember the time that Don came to my house as part of a large dinner party to celebrate the dissertation defense of one of my students, and and when we handed out the silverware, the bowl got around to me, I had no silverware, and I thought, what has happened? I thought I counted out, and so I and a graduate student had to eat with plastic spoons, and then I look over at Don's setting, and he has set a proper 1950s setting with a salad fork and a dinner fork and a soup spoon and a dessert spoon, and I'm not quite up to those standards, and so that was always very amusing to me that I didn't quite cut it for Don as a hostess. So I'm really happy that my department began the Don Meinig lecture. I'm so excited that Don got to be part of them in their early years. And I'm also happy that more than 20 years after I was handed those 3 volumes to lug around in my backpack on the University of Kentucky campus, that I got to know Don personally, and to say thank you to him for playing such a formative role in my own shaping as a geographer. Thank you.
And I have some visuals here, so maybe thank you. I'm Bill Wyckoff, and it's great to be here. I want to thank Tom Barreau and Bob Wilson, wherever you are, nearby, but not amongst us today, and the department and Don's family for being here and for helping make this celebration possible. Don was my master's and PhD advisor here at Syracuse in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And thereafter, we remained good friends for the next 35 years, a time that included many trips for me back to Syracuse, some great excursions around upstate New York with Don, and a stack of letters and postcards that we regularly exchanged over the years. For those of you that didn't know Don personally, before I deliver my remarks as Don the geographer, I just want to say a few things about him as a person. He was a wonderful man. He was generous. He was gracious. He was always the gentleman. He was intelligent. He had a wide-ranging mind. He was humane. And he lived a rich and full life beyond academe here in Syracuse and wherever his life took him. And it was my rare privilege to have known him. I do, however, want to share a few thoughts today about Don the geographer and suggesting what he meant to our discipline and to our larger world of scholarship. First, especially for those of you less familiar with this work, appreciate the sheer volume, sustained output, and enduring quality of Don's scholarship. And you can see 4 examples right here on the screen, right? His great North American Historical Geography series. His publications spanned over 50 years. They included 10 books, many of which received national and international awards. A few months ago, in a special session, and Craig, you were there too, of the Pacific Coast Geographers, chaired by Dan Ariola, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of one of Don's books. It was the one entitled Southwest, 3 Peoples in Geographical Change, 1600 to 1970. Remarkably, that book, published with Oxford University Press, remains in print. And as session participants pointed out in our meeting, its well-written synthesis of that corner of the country is an enduring example of Don's regional historical geography work, of which he produced a number of books before this whole series. In addition to books, Don also authored dozens of articles and book chapters on a dizzying variety of topics, if you look at the list over the years, that stretch from the environmental history of South Australia to a macro geography of Western imperialism. Second thing I would note is, and Jamie, you've already alluded to this, Don had a wonderful ear for language and how it could be mobilized in the service of geography. And the quality of his writing caught the attention of appreciative audiences far beyond academic geography. Specifically, Don successfully developed a particular vocabulary of words, phrases, and ideas, a narrative style that stretched our spatial, regional, and geopolitical imaginations. Consider these words and how Don integrated them into his arguments about historical geographical change, often on continental and global scales. Words like implantation, colonization, entryways, regions, core, domain, and sphere, borderlands, pathways, movements, migrations, expansion, conquest, imperialism, continentalism, fragmentation, consolidation, and globalization. As a writer, Don took these ordinary words and did extraordinary things with them in his prose. He owned them in a way only a geographer could. In fact, I would argue many of Don's ideas about American origins and imperial expansion are alive and well today in much of the burgeoning literature on settler colonialism, both in the fields of geography and history. My third observation, and I know Ann is going to talk some about this too, is that Don could then take these words and ideas and creatively transform them into wonderful maps, diagrams, and innovative visual tools that became another hallmark of his career. His sweeping Meiningen arrows, his ability to creatively map a region, and his well-crafted diagrams that explored spatial connections in fresh ways were wonderfully integrated into his narrative style. Not just as cartographic eye candy, but as part and parcel of the historical arguments that he fashioned. Let me see if I can advance this. There's some early Meiningen maps. Probably his most enduring early maps, these were from 1965, were his regional renderings of Mormon country. And that was an article that he did in the Annals, Mormon Culture Region, which he then used to explore more general ideas about cultural diffusion, cultural change, and cultural dominance. Later in his career, I know Don relished seeing many of his maps published in a series on North American geography that appeared in the National Geographic magazine. As he used to say, 10 million readers a month, and I think he enjoyed the notion that that was possible. My own choice for Don's most impactful scholarly book along these lines, I think was probably, for me anyway, Atlantic America. This was the first in that 4-volume series on North American geography. I think that book in particular, published now more than 35 years ago, had a lasting impact on how geographers and historians look at the creation of the United States and Canada. And his maps help visualize these nations as a dynamic encounter of diverse European and native peoples, all unfolding in newly emergent regional settings. And this is obviously the cover. This is one of the intro maps here. And, I could have picked many, but this is the map that just shows some of the expansion of settlement in his imaginative way from the Chesapeake Bay area into the interior, the Shenandoah, and so forth. This is another map that I think a lot of people enjoyed, and that was seeing settlement by Euro-Americans, by the French, from the perspective of the Gulf of Mexico. That's what you're looking at there. Fourth, Don had a great eye for landscape and for how ideas about landscape can help us think more deeply about a particular place or the broader world we live in. Many of his contributions here were in the form of articles and book chapters, shorter, thoughtful pieces that remain relevant today. I think about that remarkable essay in 1971 entitled Environmental Appreciation, Localities as a Humane Art. That appeared in the Western Humanities Review within a year of the first Earth Day, celebrated in 1970, a long time ago. Don, writing more than 50 years ago, argued, quote, "We have in large measure the environments we deserve. And what hope is there for any improvement in the quality of our daily life if we fail to cultivate a far larger number of people who feel passionately about the care of this earth, the landscapes of home, and the life in their own community," unquote. And this was followed later in the same decade with his The Beholding Eye, 10 versions of the same scene, which was originally published in a landscape architecture journal, and then became part of the interpretation of ordinary landscapes, the geographical essays, which appeared, I think, in the late 70s, just about the time I got here, was this collection of amazing people, as well as some of Don's own work. I think Don's more nuanced view of the cultural landscape, seeing it as both a built environment of visual features, as well as a constructed view of powerful meanings and symbols, had a lasting impact on me and on our broader field. So as much as Don relished continental and global perspectives in his work, there was this other sensibility for the significance of intimate and ordinary landscapes. Ultimately, Don's appreciation for landscape did begin at home, literally at his home. And in many of Don's letters to me later in life, he would include photographs. I think, Joe, the photographs are yours. You took them. But Don was so proud. He practiced what he preached. He was so proud that along with Lee, he created these wonderful landscapes in his backyard. And so these are some of the photos showing the planters and the flowers and how they were arranged so beautifully in the backyard. My last observation about Don is that he always understood his dual role in life, both as a scholar and as a humanist. He realized more than most of us how the discipline of geography embraced with equal weight the earth sciences, social sciences, and humanities. But as much as Don loved geography, he always imagined, I think, his audience to be far beyond our rather small disciplinary world. Don was always in conversation, both as a reader and as a writer, with scholars from many disciplines. Historians in particular read and admired his work, reviewing it in places like the New York Times. And as you mentioned, Jamie, later in life, in recognition of the breadth of his scholarship, he became a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Don's humanism was also revealed in his teaching and mentorship. He truly cared about his students, and he tried to cultivate in them a sense of wonder and excitement for places and the geographical ideas that gave them character. I was lucky to see him in action day after day. In larger lecture halls, he would, in colored chalk on the board, dash off maps of China or Ohio, and then fill them in with narratives of imperial expansion, settlement diffusion, and so forth. He was a master with the chalk. In smaller seminars, he would patiently prod nervous students, probably like me, to find out what they thought of this argument or that one. What he cultivated was never a narrow theory-driven response, but rather a willingness to explore ideas widely, to cultivate a sensibility of intellectual curiosity, and to appreciate the richness of diverse narratives in the works that we read and discussed. I'm going to conclude with a personal recollection, an experience I had many times actually with Don in his old corner office at H.B. Krause, which is where I spent my career here. Don was a master of subtle communication. And thankfully, I could read his signals sometimes fairly well. I caught on to one important tell that Don would reveal as we would sit and talk shop in his office. When his office door was open, that was always an invitation to stop in with a question or a brief discussion. So, door ajar, I would timidly knock. His back was almost always to me. He faced a small writing area covered with maps, books, and yellow pads of bold scribbles, right? Recognition? Bold scribbles, edits, and arrows. He'd swing around, and I would offer up my question about this paper or that topic. Don, always the gentleman, was impeccably patient with our scholarly discussions. But at some point, without saying a word, his eyes would sparkle a bit. That eyebrow would ever so slightly angle higher, and he would quietly remove his pocket watch and place it directly in front of him on the desk. Maybe a quick glance at the door, then back at the watch. Now, to my modest credit, I figured out what that meant. I figured out that he had to get back to work. And so I mastered the quick wrap-up and thank you and beat a hasty retreat. I'll leave you with Don's memorable words. And I'm sure many of you have read these. But as he wrote, geography is not what I do for a living, but what I do with my life. Geography is not simply a profession, it is a never-ending, life-enriching experience. And thanks to Don, our lives as geographers and as people who knew and loved him are much richer indeed. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Knowles, and it's going to be just a little difficult for me to hold it together for a minute because I am not one of Don's former students. I've never lived in Syracuse. I probably spent a total of 4 or 5 days with him and Lee, maybe altogether, maybe not that much. I've admired him from afar and known him through his work primarily, and to hear him described by loving friends who had the huge privilege of being with him does not make me sad, but I'm so jealous. Oh, gosh. And I'm so lucky to be here, especially because the weather almost prevented that. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a real honor to be here today in Don Meinig's professional hometown with members of his family, former students, and colleagues. Many here knew Don personally much better than I did, but I think it is indicative of the man and of Lee that they welcomed even an occasional visitor warmly, that they hosted me in their home, most memorably when I was 6 months pregnant and I had missed my flight, and they waited to pick me up at 1 o'clock in the morning at Syracuse Airport with nothing but hugs and warmth, and that he replied to every one of my letters and postcards. I treasure, and I think I will remember the longest, his deep rumbling voice, his deliberate speech and expressive face, his warmth, and his abiding passion for historical geography. And as an historical geographer who has often felt that she is on the ramparts fighting as part of a very small band to promote and sometimes even save our subdiscipline, his support has been absolutely invaluable and will remain so to the end of my days. What I love most in Don's scholarship is his geographic imagination. It communicated most directly to me, not in his language much as I loved it, but in maps and spatial diagrams whose sometimes radical designs, I think, show the originality of his vision, which is why I've put this up, and I'll speak about it in just a moment. In 1971, as some of you may know, Don was interviewed for the Geographers on Film series, now available online at the Library of Congress. If you want to hear his voice, go there. He said then that even as an undergraduate sitting in history courses, he knew enough geography to be able to envision relationships. He felt that a geographer looking at things historically had certain advantages. I'm quoting. There were many things he could see. That is it in a nutshell for me. And I'm not claiming that the way I understand Don's work and what I love about it most is the way anyone else should. It was that I saw in his work, and his visual work especially, what was beginning to happen in my own brain when I discovered historical geography at the age of 30 and went to graduate school. His saying, there were many things one could see, captures the aspect of Don's imagination that continues to excite me every time I return to it. His ability to visualize the spatial forms of human activity as they shape the landscape and as they operated through space and organized space. And I want to just add a note here to pick up on some of Jamie's observations. I think Don's work will have a huge renaissance in 10 or 20 years, when people realize that theory only goes so far, and that in order really to understand the world, one also needs to be extremely attentive, give long, close observation to whatever one is studying, and that in fact to describe something really well is the first step toward knowing. Well, as a new graduate student in geography, some decades ago, one of the first books I read was Volume 1 of The Shaping of America. I was stunned by many of its maps, which were unlike any I had ever seen. This one is called A Model of the British Atlantic Empire circa 1750. It shows an arc of seaboard colonies and dangling sugar islands tethered to the metropole, extensions of a system of subjugation first worked out in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. This figure still mesmerizes me. It says so much, so economically, It abstracts power as connections tied to the umbilicus of London on the right side, what Latour calls a center of calculation. Its very abstraction suggests the rapacious utilitarian God's eye view of the so-called New World from England. At the same time, it suggests the limited European presence on the rim of a vast continent occupied by other people. And something I'm coming to realize, this has been a wonderful prompt to go back to much of Don's work from the 1980s. He was talking and writing about and visualizing the presence of indigenous peoples long before many historians were. People who were already feeling sharp pressure from British aggression and the claiming of native lands by settler colonists. Second, this one, which is irresistible, a map of the North Atlantic world whose circuits never stop moving, and whose subject is as much the ocean at its center as it is the landings from which Europeans and Africans were departing and just beginning to set foot in 1630. This trio of spatial diagrams to which Bill referred captures the strikingly different kinds of spatial interaction between the English, French, and Spanish colonizers and indigenous peoples. We mustn't just speak of settler colonists because there were many types, and you need to know them to understand what happened. And last, this conceptual diagram of the transatlantic slave trade system. All of these are from Volume 1 of The Shaping of America, and I agree with Bill, that was an explosion of visual creativity. While Don's writing carefully explains the peoples, movements, places, and support systems of this complex inhuman trade over many pages, this diagram distills it all to structure, interaction, and the many kinds of societies involved at each step and their spatial relationships. I think it's genius. Marcia Harrington was the graphic designer and cartographer who rendered these figures. She told me some years ago that Don would bring her pencil sketches to get started, but the real meat of his communication came in his explanation of the concepts and geographical relationships that he wanted a map or diagram to show. The theory behind things, as she put it, which is going to be my starting point for working, I hope, on a fresh piece about his visual mastery. Don Meinig eschewed theory. In that 1971 interview that I mentioned, he said theory was, quote, description at a certain level of generalization. To some, that would seem dismissive. His writing is empirical and richly, densely descriptive. He understood geography as fundamentally the art and science of describing the earth and life upon it. Yet his most profound effect on me has come from his bold visual summations of power, movement, and spatial relations. His work with Marcia Harrington made me think, as a young geographer, that geographic explanation had to be visual as well as verbal, because visual explanations most fully convey what you see when you understand something geographically. So, at a very formative moment in my professional life, Don was one of a small handful of people who convinced me there was room in geography for creative expression. I can't say he directly inspired any of my graphic choices, but he opened a door. And I like to think that I had his blessing in going through. I think he may have best appreciated my graphic translation of a Welsh folk song into a map that traces the journey of a Welsh farmer over the mountains to Merthyr Tydfil. I heard, Dacw fe yn mynd yn y bore bach, yn y cart I Ferthyr tan ganu yn iach, and I saw a map. And so it became in the first book that Don kindly reviewed for me. Don and Lee loved Wales, as many of you know. I lived in Wales. I learned to speak Welsh, and it was a special, lovely bond for us. These days, I do very different work on the geographies of the Holocaust. More than any subject I've worked on, this one requires graphic imagination to grasp the continental scale of what happened without losing sight of the important differences between places, the significance of forests and soil types, what people could and could not see and hear, how places were created and destroyed for goals that were every bit as much about spatial imaginaries as they were about racial ideology. Although I never had the opportunity to talk with Don in any depth about this new vein of work, I feel his encouragement still. I'd like to end with one more image from The Shaping of America. I've focused on Don's maps and spatial diagrams because of their impact on my way of working, but I was also influenced, particularly as a teacher, by his captions, his probing descriptions of historical images, which taught me, to a great extent, how to read visual art as historical evidence. This is a watercolor of a farm on the Illinois prairie by the Swiss-born artist Karl Bodmer, one of my favorites, painted in 1833. It is reproduced in black and white in The Shaping of America, but here's how Don describes this quiet landscape. Bodmer provided us with some of the most accurate and penetrating pictures of the vernacular landscape. Here in some small prairie west of the lower Wabash, I said left, west of the lower Wabash, he gives us a rare view of a pure upland South farmstead. The double crib log barn, the log, perhaps dog trot house with wide roof overhang and end chimney, the well sweep and rail fences. There is also a suggestion here of a rectangularity in the fields, but we cannot be sure if that displays an individualistic Southerner being disciplined by a national system, or merely the tidiness of a German artist who finished this painting from his sketches when he returned home. This is Don's humor and his keen eye at work, analyzing critically while deeply appreciating what he saw in a work of art in history. In the world, always the geographer.
Good afternoon. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the department for hosting this event. I want to send out my thoughts to the mining family. It's just really a pleasure to be here with you folks today. And I'm going to do a treacherous experiment here, trying to talk from my tablet because I was editing on the fly, literally, as I came up here. So. And when I got here, I found that it's really disorienting to arrive and be in this city, to be in Syracuse, and not have a chance to sit and chat with Don. I came here in 1979 with the single purpose of working with this fine gentleman. And he was probably one of the first people that I had any contact with here. Over the years, I've come back several times, and on each occasion, I have spent time with him, chatting, at his home, where he proudly displays those rock stone walls that Bill was showing us earlier. I'm glad you got a chance to see those. Talking about how he'd scavenge the stones throughout the region. Driving around Syracuse, and as he showed me new additions to the Syracuse landscape, or elements of the landscape that had disappeared. Or sometimes grabbing a bite at a restaurant, sandwiches, sometimes down in Cazenovia. I originally arrived here, consider myself something of a master of mischief at my former school. And I never really felt that that prankster in me was fully appreciated in this department. Nonetheless, Don was always incredibly gracious with me and made me feel that my academic work, even without the mischief, was appreciated. So I'm deeply indebted to him and to this department for the many opportunities that flowed from my education here. I initially met Don when he came to Louisiana State University, where I was a master's student. He was part of a group of stellar scholars who were invited to give a series of lectures. And I was in the spring of 1979, and I was fortunate to be invited by a field trip organizer to accompany him on a field trip. Milton Newton, who was a professor at LSU at the time, and a NASCAR driver wannabe, was behind the wheel. And believe me, we went careening through the sugarcane fields and through countless upland South hamlets, veering from ditch to ditch. It was a hair-raising experience, to say the least. But Don was remarkably composed during the entire excursion. And he maintained a line of questioning that clearly revealed that he was unflappable and also incredibly curious and also knowledgeable. And after the field trip, when we returned to the classroom, he offered artful and eloquent lectures that provided a preview of his Shaping of America series. And it was this brief exposure with him back in 1977 that prompted me to apply to do graduate work with him several years later. It was encountering a master of the craft that prompted that application. While others have spoken about at greater length about his scholarship and international recognition, I just want to mention a couple of things here about that his scholarship on symbolic landscapes directly influenced my dissertation. His insightful essay about the power of New England villages, Main Street towns, and the auto suburb helped me conceptualize the role of religious structures in shaping the landscape of Midwestern towns. His edited collection, Interpretations of Ordinary Landscapes, had just appeared when I arrived, and in the years since, I've been constantly amazed at the number of scholars from a range of fields who are familiar with that work and find it a significant influence in their own work. This is another picture from when I was up here for, when I had the privilege of giving one of the mining lectures. In addition to his widely acclaimed scholarship, Don was also a steady and supportive mentor. One spring, while I was a student here, he suggested that I apply for a summer internship at the Cooperstown Museum program just down the road. Little did I realize his prescience. And even though I didn't follow his advice, my first job several years later was with the Illinois State Museum, where I spent a decade. He obviously was alert to the limited job market at the time and offered sound guidance to consider other options, which I didn't take. Sometime later, several years later, I reached a point following my general exams where I considered scrapping my entire PhD ambition. But Don, through gentle support and continued interest in my work, rekindled the drive and helped me persevere. And after completing my degree, in the midst of a huge trough in the job market, he wrote countless letters that helped me break into the professional ranks. And beyond that direct assistance, he had little subtle back channels to add to former students advancing in their profession. Each time I packed up and drug my wife and we moved to a new job somewhere else, Don would send a letter out to one of his friends, alerting to the fact that I was coming to town. They'd call me, we'd go have lunch with them, have a visit with them, and Michael Conson and Campbell Pennington stand out as members of the Don Mining Network that became our friends, largely through his gentle nudges. One of the things that I'm most proud of is the special issue of the Geographical Review that Bill Wyckoff and I put together in 2009. Largely, Bill did a lot of the heavy lifting here. Don was reluctant to indulge in such honorific assemblages, but Bill convinced him to let us proceed, and he tolerated our work. It provided a forum for several former students to pay homage to their mentor and for colleagues to comment on his place in American geography. There are few historical geographers who are so deserving of such a collection. And indeed, I can't imagine the geographical literature without such a volume, and I hope it rose to his standards. It's not a reflection of our work, it's a reflection to his place in the academy. While he was uneasy with praise, Don was not above considering his place in the academy. He eloquently advocated for historical geography to historians and other humanities scholars. He was also sensitive to reviews of his own work, whether his critics were concerned with his use of the language, his attention to the physical landscape, or his treatment of particular social groups. I sensed that he realized that as a prominent geographer, he was subject to such criticism and endured it with an amazing grace. And I think that was an amazing, a valuable lesson for all of us. And returning to maps we've seen, but this was one of my favorites because it kind of comes from close to home. And what strikes me is it's really great that we're hearing more about his cartographic imagination and visions. And today it might seem odd to mention that maps are a prominent part of a geographer's toolkit, but they have fallen by the wayside in recent years among certain segments of our profession. Cartography has suffered in the era of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, when everyone or anyone can download data and produce a visualization complete with pixelated content. And of course, critical social theorists oftentimes shun the map as a tool of the privileged that perpetuates unfair biases. But Don employed the map with artistry. He never strived for analytical detail, but he presented sweeping interpretations of relationships and processes. His maps were alive. They were executed by skilled cartographers, and they offered valuable orientation, even if forcing us to see things from a fresh vantage point, as this map of the entry to New Orleans. And they amplified his prose by depicting the movement of people, commerce, and ideas that he wrote about. In this era, in the academy, where impact factors oftentimes are the measure of quality scholarship, his collection of books and articles likely wouldn't stand out, unfortunately. But he practiced historical geography in an era when synthesis in comprehensible prose were still measures of quality. And last fall, Dan Ariola, as Bill mentioned, assembled a group of us to consider the impact of Don's Southwest Three Peoples in geographical change. And Dan did his own tabulation of metrics that I think are quite revealing. 11 reprintings of Southwest between 1971 and 1978. And it's still in print, as Bill mentioned, 50 years on. As for Don's capstone achievement, the 4 volumes of Shaping in America, it is on the shelves of 6,000 libraries around the world, according to WorldCat. Check and see how many other books reach that total. It will probably be the Bible and things of that sort. And in an era of tight library budgets and declining book purchases, this is truly remarkable. Also, it's hard to imagine someone taking on such a sweeping treatment of the historical geography of the United States again. It will unquestionably stand as an enduring classic because its author wrote in a timeless way that is not subject to academic impulses or tortured jargon. The metrics of the moment might not favor his accomplishments, but his exemplary scholarship will be recognized for generations. And this, to me, the enduring value is a more meaningful measure of work of this scope and scale. Thank you. Now let me do one more quick thing. No, you're done. This is my landscape. This is 2 blocks from Don's house where I lived. This was my experience in Syracuse: spring, summer, fall, and winter.
And they didn't tell us when we moved here that the first 3 go by in about 3 weeks. All right, this one's for John Western, and now for something completely different. Can you hear me, John? Okay, thank you.
Be respectful now.
Have you met me before? Well, Jamie, you were right. I mean, not that you don't have to be best, but how do I follow that? And any of it. I'm going to lose it like Anne. Not that you lost it, but I will. I'm so honored and pleased to be here with, well, you guys are fine, but with these guys especially. I had not planned to do this today. I was not on the program. I came up here just to attend this event, and I'll tell you some of the other things I did while I was here. But Bob Wilson put me in this by getting COVID. It's his fault. After he asked if I would do something and Tom asked if I would do something, I deferred and I went offline and talked to Craig and said, Craig, you do it. You'll be fine. But I arrived here this afternoon to find my name on the table. I blame Jamie Winders for making her read 3 volumes of Don Meinig's work 30 years ago. So I've been trying to, I don't know what I'm going to say, so bear with me and be kind. I came here because about 4 years ago, Jamie and I, with the kind permission of Don's family, went to his home office and worked to sort of assemble the last of his materials that he had sort of slowly winnowed down and taken to Cumberland Avenue. We did a pretty good job. We sent some stuff off to Utah and stuff to the archives, but there was just this last 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 boxes left that we just didn't know what to do with. Some of them were the books that none of us could stand to get rid of, the classics. And then a lot of it was correspondence. And so I've been here for the last 2.5 days, sitting in a little office, not so little office, nice actually, office up in the top of Maxwell, going through that last bit of correspondence. I'm trying not to read it. It's a funny, tricky thing to have other people's correspondence in front of you. I've mostly been looking at the salutation and the ending and putting them into the right files. But I ended up with 2 boxes with a pretty lot of correspondence between Don and about 40 or 50 people. It's a pretty amazing body of work, I think, and it is a body of work, and it reminds me of Anne's map. Don got us to think about the world with these connections, and I always see things in those ways, and I see this correspondence in that way, only this time the metropole is right here. It's a metropole of social relations between Don and his former students, between Don and big thinkers. I'm so pleased to see in their big, thick files from Henry Glassy, the famous folklorist, from Pierce Lewis, from Wilbur Zielinski, from Cole Harris. And the reason we couldn't figure out what to do with this stuff, you think, well, that should be in the archives, is that it's never entirely professional and it's never entirely personal. It's both. And there's a warmth of professional relationship, of support, of community building, really, that spans the world. It's kind of humbling, actually, to read it. Or to catalog it. I still don't know what we're going to do with it. I'm tempted to mail every folder back out to the person who originated the stuff and let them enjoy it, but we'll see what happens. I made a few notes while people were talking. I was listening too, don't worry. So there's been some talk about Don as, well, these days it's really important, and I believe this. I'm not making fun of this, but we use the word mentor that didn't exist when I was a younger person. It should have, but it didn't need to if you had Don Meinig as an advisor. I remember the first day I came here, he took out the new cohort and we walked around downtown Syracuse. It was pretty much the same as it is now, unfortunately. And he introduced us to his city. I also remember quickly that he also had a Manhattan at the end of the tour. And to be honest, I can't drink a Manhattan or a Coke, not the new variety, without thinking about Don to this day. He was welcoming, he was supportive, and you might be a little jealous, but I would just like to point out that the nostalgia of 30 years of hindsight can actually hide the trepidation that we had when knocking on that door. You might have noticed that Bill actually hunched over and clenched when he was telling us about knocking on the door. You yes, the door was open. If the door was open, you could go in, but you sure as hell better be ready for that conversation. Or at least that's the way I felt. And if you were, yeah, it was a wonderful conversation. And you never put the watch in front of me, Bill. I don't know. One of the, I mean, so I'm not going to talk about the work, really. I mean, Jamie did a wonderful job of putting into the context of the discipline, and Bill addressed the work, call the work, and I don't know what I'm going to leave you guys with. And you did a wonderful sort of sense, I think, of the aesthetic of the work in many ways, and I use that word because it was a Don word in a really important way. And Craig, much the same, bringing the work into its thinking about what it means today and how we might have a revival and a renaissance of certain kinds of cartography and things. I can't do that. I will speak about, I guess, one of the things I would like to say is that one of the things that was kind of a leitmotif or not so leitmotif was Don's ostensible eschewal of theory. And I think that was disingenuous. I think it was disingenuous. I mean, now you have to realize I'm probably the one student who took the dark side and became the person who was taken by social theory. But I will tell you that Don one time closed the door to his office and confessed to me that he had read Michel Foucault. Don had an openness to ideas, and he let us do what we wanted to do. I didn't really do the things that I ended up doing until I left here. I came here not because I read Volume 1 or Volume 2. They didn't exist. I came here because really I was sent here by Pierce Lewis because I was trying to be a landscape scholar and something was missing. And for me, I thought what was missing was the historical dimensions of landscape. And so I came here thinking about landscape and I left here as an historical geographer. And I will claim that title forever. But yeah, that theory was kind of disingenuous. Don was not atheoretical. His work is deeply theoretical, and it's deeply conceptual in ways that endure. And it's deeply theoretical and conceptual in ways that he's thought about. What he eschewed was jargon, what he called jargon. And I took issue with him on the issue of what is jargon. But he was always supportive, and I came to realize that we had conversations over the years on these very topics. And I will, not to make this about me, but I will never forget that what he made me is what everybody else has talked about here is deeply conscious of my writing, deeply conscious of the empirical specificity, the richness and the wholeness and of the work that my theory was built on. I have no idea how long I've been talking here. Somebody better
Watch out. Yeah.
Yeah, that was your cue. All right, what else was I going to say? I'm getting, it's really not much more I wanted to say. I will say that I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I had correspondence from both Joe Wood, a scholar who to this day still can't figure out if he flipped the coin the right way when he decided to go to Penn State instead of coming here, and has been a lifelong fan of Don's and thought about coming. And I had several correspondences with Dan Ariola, who also wanted to come, and they both wanted me to say hello to the assembled crowd and express their appreciation of Don's work. I'm going to take a chance here. I'm going to do my best Don Meinig interpretation. It comes after one of those days when you've been bold enough to knock on the door. For me, it came especially at that time when I had no idea what my thesis or dissertation was going to be about. I struggled. Don would not help you. Well, he would not help me. I'm assuming he didn't help you guys, because none of us did Don's work. He was not about social reproduction. He was not about making us like him. He was about ideas and following the ideas. And so he would let me go on and on. He might suggest I was telling Bill today, I go over to Auburn and do some sketches. Does anybody remember when he was into sketching in the late 80s? I found his sketchbooks at one point. And I would get frustrated, but eventually, I found a topic. I did okay. But Don, on those times, would sit down in his chair like this, and he'd put his feet up on the desk, and he'd put his hands behind his head, and he'd say, "I will have no schools named after me." Well, I think that he failed. Look at this. Look at this room. Maybe he didn't build a school, but he sure as hell built a community.
So yeah, I would invite the panel to take their seats, and I think we've got a lot of time, and so there's no need to hurry. What I would say is that this is a great opportunity for if people have questions, if they'd like to share their own stories. We'll have, for those of you who are attending the dinner, there'll be time then as well to, and there are some people who are definitely going to be sharing some reminiscences and things that they wrote at the dinner. But if anybody else would like to share anything, have any questions for folks on the panel, this would be a great time. I have, there's one microphone in the back. I have this one as well. So if you would like to say something, or I would welcome the panel as well if you would like to share something or ask something of one another, that would be great too. If you do want to say something, please raise your hand, and either Matt or I will get a microphone to you.
Hi there, sorry, Bruce Bakery. I think the question we're all wondering, and perhaps Professor Winders, you can answer, is what are the name of these sandwich shops and where can we find them? They sound very good.
He never told me the name of where we're going, and he only gave me turn-by-turn directions, including when to slow down and when to double check before I turn. So that was after he rode with me a few times, so it may be my driving. They explain that.
Thank you. One of the themes that comes up in the conversations is just Don's strengths as a teacher. And so I guess I would be really curious, as somebody who's now sort of in a position teaching a big undergraduate lecture, were there particular things that made Don's teaching, what stood out? What were things that he did as a teacher, maybe that you've taken into your teaching, maybe that you think stuck with students, lessons that those of us who are still kind of trying to think about our own teaching and imparting that way of kind of being a geographer? Are there lessons we can take?
I got something. I'm not going to speak to undergraduate teaching. I was his TA my first semester here, and I walked into the classroom the first day, and he drew one of those outlines on the board, and I thought, I'm done. What am I going to do ever? But I was making a list today because Bill and I were talking earlier about all of Don's students, about 41 total. 22 PhD students and 18 MA students. And that's a lot of graduate students. And it made me think about the seminars that we used to have. In the first seminar we had, Don came in and he was carrying a stack of books that he really should have had a trolley and atlases and things and he sat them on the table. And then we had the seminar, we had assigned reading and we talked about it and we hashed it out and then we'd be done and he'd pick up the books and he'd leave. And this went on all semester, and I couldn't figure out why he kept coming with his books. And I finally asked him, and he said, I'm always afraid I'm going to run out of something to say. Oh. Which I know is hard to believe, but what I really took from that in my own, and he always let us talk, actually. And I took two things from that. One is that a good seminar, I know it's hard to believe when you listen to me, but a good seminar is about listening, and it's about letting students do the work and in a graduate seminar and giving them the space and the time to not be able to jump in and to speak. And it's also about being prepared in case that doesn't work. But I mean, really prepared and knowing the stuff that you came into the room with. So I don't know if that helps at all.
I think he was always very thoughtful and organized. And I think he brought to a lecture an idea or a theme that grabbed people early on, hopefully, I don't think he just wandered in and it was off the top of his head. He was always well prepared. And I sat in on some of his undergraduate stuff too, and I found that he tried to, follow that advice of tell them what you're going to do it, great chalk drawings on the board, and then tell him you've done it. And he was always real thoughtful about framing a theme for the day. That's what I recall. In terms of seminars, I remember, I think we did one on the South when I first got here, and he was writing about the South, starting his multi-volume work. And I remember the terror on a Tuesday afternoon, about 4:30 in the afternoon, I'd find a 750-page book in my little box. And he said, please report on this on Thursday morning. And so he was demanding of his seminars.
I'd block that out.
Yeah, but they were wonderful experiences, and as we've, I think, said, he really encouraged us to talk a lot, and I think that got, all of us at least more at ease with that, that great tradition of scholarly conversation. And so Don he never came to a seminar and lectured. He came with maybe the stack of books, but he always threw an idea or two out there. And frankly, I've done a seminar in the American West at Montana State since '86, and that, I kind of took that model, and at least for me, it also works. So I thank him for that, as well.
I think one other part of teaching was his incredible attention to editing your written work when you turn things in. I mean, he had incredibly high standards, and you were always striving to do something because you knew the quality of his prose. But I think he was offered sound criticism, supportive criticism that really brought out the best in the writers. And to your point about sketching, he never pushed sketching on me, but I have found, and I think I learned this when he'd go in and draw these incredibly detailed maps on the board, that is a way for me to think through a writing problem. And I actually encourage all my students now, if you're stuck, if you're having writer's block, can you sketch out the flow of ideas? It's not necessarily drawing a map, but the flow of ideas. How do you get from point A to point B to C to D? And I think that sketching things out is evidence in the maps that Ann showed today. And I think that's a very effective way to help people write better.
So thank you, first of all, for all of your reminiscences, which have been amazing to listen to. Several of you now have mentioned Don drawing maps on the chalkboard. And it reminded me of a conversation I had early in my time here when I was a new assistant professor, and Don knew that I was getting some negative feedback about the fact that I was so old-fashioned that I taught using the chalkboard, yeah, which I still am so old-fashioned that I do. And he was gently encouraging to me about it, in contrast to some of my other senior colleagues. And he told me an anecdote that early in his career when he was at Utah, he had done a weekly television show on public television. Huh. And he said he wanted to be able to draw maps, but he wanted them to look creditable when he did so. And so he would go into the studio in advance and put dots on the chalkboard too small to be seen. So that as he was in the midst of actually being taped, or I don't know if it was live or taped, that he could simply walk over and connect the dots and appear to be fluidly
just drawing
on the board. And so I do wonder whether that was behind those maps that you saw. I'll just mention quickly a couple other things. Ann mentioned his voice. And I will say that some of you know that my wife teaches down in the Newhouse School of Communication. And she used to always say, Don has a voice that was made for broadcast. And I'll also say, as much as I admire you all, Don did not, and his work did not belong to the historical geographers. It belongs to all of us, I think, particularly the shaping of America. I'm a physical geographer, but any geographer there's just so much in there. It's for all of us.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been amazing. Just transcends the man. His ideas are obviously so important to geography. So as a geographer, I really appreciate this. First, I'll start with a comment, then I have a question. My comment is just about the posterity of his work. So I'm an advanced PhD student, and I've TA'd for first year geography GE courses. And one of the assignments that I've stolen from Todd Rutherford when I TA'd for him is the students have to read The Beholding Eye, and they have to go out and find a landscape, and they have to write about it using one of those vantage points. And it's amazing to see these, young people still find resonance, or they find it relevant, this essay, and they connect to the landscape through his work. So his work lives on beyond, in this digital age. They can pause and go outside and take a moment to reflect on the landscape. So it's really great to hear this discussion. My question, though, is about his writing process. Such a prolific writer. Obviously, he's very long-lived. But can any of you talk about what his writing process entailed? How did he accomplish so much writing? And thank you.
I would just say, and I was only here a few years, but one thing that always impressed me was his incredible routine, his regularity. He just made it and integrated it into his life every day. I see him come in, and he might have a morning free of teaching or something, and that's when often the door was closed, in fact, right? And he would be in there, he would write, and it would be day after day, week after week, year after year.
And the thing is, he would walk.
Yes, you're right. He would walk in. That's a good point, John.
By God, I'm sure he wasn't daydreaming.
Absolutely.
No, actually, he was creatively daydreaming.
No, I think you're right. He often walked to work, and then he would walk down the hill at lunchtime, over to the varsity or something. And I think that was a great time for him to think. Yeah, it's a good point.
I have a crackpot theory about it that I'm happy to share. And it's really just about, I was here when the 4-volume series was in full swing. And at one point, I think one of my tasks was to take a list and go get books at the library and bring them back as part of my assistantship duties, to be piled on his desk. And the desk was always piled with books. And I'm perfectly prepared to be corrected on this. As I said, this is just a theory. But, that series at least was, while it was deeply researched, it was not what we think of as archival original research. It was dependent upon basically the historiography. I actually think if you read those volumes back to back, I don't know who would do that, but if you could, I think you can actually see sort of changes in the discipline of history as well, and who gets cited, and who the citations are, what some of the not very deeply, but what some of the themes become, because you are in some ways dependent upon that historiography for telling the tale. But I always got this sense that, and maybe it was the walks in, that the secret was Don knew exactly what he wanted to say. Right, the framework was there. The maps were in his mind. The metropoles and the networks, they were there. And so it was really a matter, and I think the discipline. I took from him the discipline of writing, doing it, and I can remember going in and he would be reading a book and he'd be looking at it very carefully. And I've now gone through his papers twice, some of them, and I can see the ways in which he underlined, even your letters, like letters that you would write. He would, what am I going to respond to? And he would underline that. I've looked at my own letters that I would write, and he would underline them and figure out what he was going to respond to. And I'm guessing that's the way he actually read these books. Right? He wasn't really sort of reading them in qua their own work. He was reading them for how it helped him reshape the thinking and the way he wanted to talk about things. That's my theory. I don't know.
I have two little things to add, the two little glimpses I had into his process. One was over a wonderful lunch at the Conra Hotel outside of Aberystwyth in Wales, I must say. It was absolutely delicious, and he paid, and it was so wonderful. So we had the best of everything. But at that lunch, I remember, I was talking with him about what I would do after my dissertation, and he said, that's the spore. Ideas, as others have said, were so generative for him, like really a germ, the way a germ in a seed is the rich part. And as long as he had that, if he figured that out, so much would unfold from it. I was thinking about that spatial diagram of the slave trade. You know how before they send up satellites into space, now they fold them up, and the way the telescope was all folded up, that's sort of what his diagrams are like, and that's what his thinking was like, that the ideas would unfurl in his writing, I think. And the other one was, he said, just kind of in passing, the way he would toss off stuff that sticks forever, he said, I never read without a map at my side. I've given that advice to my students many times. You have to cultivate the spatial way of thinking if you're interested in really having it.
You know, you just brought back a memory. It was a map and a magnifying glass.
And oftentimes
It was a magnifying glass on that chest that had the maps on it.
And oftentimes an Irwin Brace map, the
Yes.
landforms of the United States, because he was very attentive to physical geography, even though some people say he didn't pay much attention to that.
You know, I wanted to be like Don, so I keep a magnifying glass next to my desk.
Can I say something about Lee?
Yeah.
Because when I stayed with them the first time was when I learned about her journals. That when they would travel together to the Wye Valley was what we mostly talked about in Southeast Wales because we had the connection about Wales. She was the one who kept the journals of their travels, and he would read them, and she would read them to him at the end of the day. And so they had a mutual, or I don't know what the word would be, his family could tell us, but a sort of two geographical and historical minds, loving travel, absorbing what they saw. So what was the line? Was it Bill or Rich who said that it was his life?
Right.
Yeah.
Just a way of life, yeah.
So it was the richness of life always included that. It didn't have to be scholarly. You don't call it that. You just love it.
I think so.
Why?
So the thing that's fascinating for me, so I was never taught by Don, and I got to know Don. I knew Don. I became very familiar with Don's work as an undergrad. Not paying any attention. But I got to know Don as a person well after he had retired, and in listening to you all talk, it's just stunning to me how many I start all of my undergraduate lectures with today's plan, and then we go through it, and then there's a wrap-up slide. I have no idea where that came from, but what
I taught it.
but there are other elements, and I think it's just, for me, it's really interesting to think about the ways that a scholar's influence really becomes intergenerational when you work with someone trained by that person, because I can see all these aspects of how I think about things, and then how I've interacted with my students, and why I'm always writing source on the end of sentences of claims that students are making that I couldn't really put a finger on where it came from, but I do think a lot of it goes back to the way that Rich was trained by Don, and that all of you were shaped as scholars to think about, synthesis and empirics, to think about that abstraction, whether you call it social theory or you call it grand narrative, and that deep engagement with place. And that, to me, is just really fascinating to think about how these practices move across generations.
I have to say, and it wasn't, I never really liked the word training when we talk about graduate students, although I understand it, but I don't feel like I was trained. It was a gentle leading or a gentle modeling. When Bill said that thing about the Rotary Club thing, tell them what you're going to say, tell them, and then tell them what you said, I suddenly realized, of course. I mean, I've done that all my life. Now I know, you're right, I know where I got it, but yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a very, and you talked about this, he mentored people. He spent so much time with us. And I remember going in for some of those longer sessions, when I had submitted drafts of things, and he would just take a couple of hours and we would go through the pages. And, he was very attuned to style, obviously, as well as sources and how one worded things. And he would spend the time, and I hope I've passed some of that on to some of my students over the years, but he was very generous, and especially in terms of the kinds of things that were on his plate and how busy he was. He really was willing to explore language with you and do that in a way that is very, very special, I think. And so I learned a lot from him in those sessions. Some of them weren't always that pleasant because some of my language was very, very lacking or absent. And he was always keen to add more, and that's why I think my dissertation unfortunately became 2 volumes. He kept saying, well, why don't we do a chapter on this? And why don't we do more on that? And great idea. Make a note on my yellow pad. But no, he was always so quick with good ideas like that. And so I've tried to, like I say, pass some of that on. I suppose we all have to our students. But it was great to be trained with him and mentored by him.
And I would say that a couple of people made this point already, but he expected you to come up with your dissertation topic.
Yes, yeah.
It was not this laboratory where you're doing one part of some grand scheme that's in the advisor's mind. And in a way that gives you a tremendous amount of confidence because once you complete it, you are the authority. You are the world's authority. And that's what I tell my students now when they're getting uneasy about their general exams or mainly about their dissertation defense. You're going to know more about this topic than anybody else in the room. Be confident, go in and impress us. And I think that was a subtle part of his training. He gave you the ability to become the expert and not the subservient secondary author.
Right. And that's another thing I didn't appreciate at the time. I mean, now often a model given, funding streams and so forth for students, right, is okay, I got this amount of money, I got this amount of lab time or whatever, and you can do this piece of my work. And I didn't appreciate how much I learned by floundering and thinking through what it was going to be my work, as Craig said. And that was a great privilege. He never handed out topics like that. And so I think hopefully I think we're all the better for that. But that was another part of his mentoring.
If I may, he also, as it turned out, pardon me? First and foremost, as I tell everybody, I was his longest running graduate student and never passed the course. I'm his son-in-law, and I spent 45 wonderful years. He was curious, first of all, about everything. When he was transferred to the nursing home, we always marveled that he took his glasses off and he would sit there and he would point to the brick further than I could see and say, "Look at the ant. It's following the path of the brick." And he would watch the ant travel and how it did it. And that's part of what his mind was. He and I used to, my office is downtown, and for a good 25 years I walked back and forth to work. And I walked where we were on the other side of campus. I walked by HBC every day. If the corner light was on, I didn't knock. I waited till he said I could come in. And his mail case came from our house. And his curiosity was based upon the fact that he had an eye of an artist, not of a scholar. He saw all of us and saw how all of us reacted to our world. And he learned from that. He would talk to me about things. He and I had one thing in common. We both came from parents who were not educated. And he was a farm boy. He felt things. And geography, he felt both intellectually and emotionally. He cared about how geography made somebody's life better or worse. And he turned me on to a way of thinking, which took a long time for him to do, unfortunately, which was unique. He was not a survivalist like many of our parents were. He was a creator and an observer. And what he really did was take what all of us see every day and ignore, and he examined it. He would be in the middle of a snowstorm here in Syracuse, a rare event, and he would say to me, "Look how beautiful the flakes are," while I was sitting there saying, "I gotta shovel my goddamn driveway." He marveled at the flake. And it is that eye and his caring that made him. Don't give it to me.
No, I think you're right. He had that sensibility, that eye. That's a great descriptive word for it. And he was endlessly curious. And so that's what made having a seminar with him so wonderful, because he was always learning. And it was a great vehicle, I think, for him to hear us with our ideas and then share his ideas with us. And just walking down the street or out on the New York landscape together, as we were several times, I could just see that always working, and it was a wonderful thing. And he enjoyed it so much. But he had that eye for not only places, but also ideas. And you had a great experience of a lifetime with that, I think, sitting down.
To be a slow learner.
That's right. It pays.
Here.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say on behalf of the family, as the eldest daughter, I'll take this as my privilege, to speak to you on behalf of my sisters and Don's grandchildren and even his great-grandchildren. It is just remarkable that you all came today and have done this wonderful thing in his honor. As I said to several of you, as you know, because of COVID, when he died, there was no funeral, there was no memorial as such. But I feel like today you've given that to us, and it's a gift that we will long remember and truly appreciate. And as I'm listening to all of you speak, I'm taken back to the fact that when we were young, we traveled this country every summer. We would get in the car and drive to the west because that's where all the relatives were. So we spent many, many days looking at Nebraska cornfields. I think it was corn, I don't know. He would have pointed it out. But I think the gift that he gave us was the landscape.
Yeah.
We were in the landscape. We were part of the landscape. We had to know about the landscape. You couldn't drive through Nebraska without knowing what you were looking at, even if you wanted to read your book in the back seat. He had things to say about geography and places. And I think the greatest gift that I've walked away with from the geographer, Don, is a sense of place and how important it is and how it shapes us and how it moves us And I'm so grateful to each and every one of you. Your names are familiar to us, you know, you were talked about at dinner, and we know you all. We are better than you think, maybe.
Could you tell us some more about those things that were said over there?
They're doing citation.
It's just a lovely thing that you did for all of us, and on behalf of my sisters and myself, so grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your dad with us.
I'm sorry, I have to say that's the best thing I've heard all day. The dad making you look at the landscape. And I'm going to tell you because it's very personal. Because my children have accused me of that always. And I'd like to think that I've passed it down from somebody. My justice came when my daughter, who said we did this all the time and made them go look at landscapes, ended up being a geography major at college.
Mine too.
I took my kids on the entire Oregon Trail, and we repeated it, and that's why I think neither of them are geographers.
I will say one thing. When we travel, we were never lost. It was always, we were on a GSR.
There you go.
Which is known as a Geographer's Scenic Route.
When we would say, nobody knows you're a geographer, you could ask.
Ah, that's the best thing I've heard all day.
One thing that I'd like to say, first of all, I just would like to thank all of your comments. I'd like to thank Don's family. Those are really touching words. I feel, when I introduced myself, I said I'm the current chair. I can relate to Don's comments about them not looking back fondly on being chair. I'm counting the days. I think there are 82 left until I'm no longer chair. But I also feel, an honor and a privilege to be in this position, in part because people like Don have been in this position before. I feel like I'm not I'm just the occupant of the chair, and my job is to sort of shepherd this wonderful department and thinking about the people who've been here before me and the people who will be here once I'm gone. It's a real honor. Before we go to the reception, I would like to ask the panel to one other question, to maybe think about our graduate students. We have several our first and second year graduate students and some more advanced graduate students here. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how the department, or let me say, how the discipline has changed over time. And one of the themes that has emerged from the conversation today, given the span and the scope of Don's work, over 50 years in the department, and this towering figure in the department and in the discipline, is how much the discipline has changed. And some of that is just the mechanics and the technologies. Students do GIS now. They tend not to be cartographers. Geography doesn't use cartography nearly as much as we used to. We have PowerPoint, and very few people just use a chalkboard anymore. So some of it is the mechanics. Some of it is the way that critical theory has changed over time. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways that the department, the discipline has changed for better or worse, right? The good and the bad, where that leaves us, and how the lessons of Don's career and life can be carried on for the young generation, the people who are much less familiar, who didn't overlap with Don, and who are looking at a rather different disciplinary landscape.
In 35 pages or less?
Yeah.
I'll say something. I always will. I'm going to avoid the question to some extent. I think there's one aspect, I think, of being an historical geographer that makes you a bit of an iconoclast in the discipline, and always has been, forever, Sauer notwithstanding. Carl Sauer. Anyway, but as you were talking, I'm thinking maybe I'm just the right age. I mean, I hit Syracuse at the changing of the guard. I'm an historical geographer. I'm also feel like I'm trained in cultural geography, and I worked with one of Sauer's last students and was drawn here in part because another of his last students was here, and then I worked with a person who would have given his eye teeth to be Sauer's last student, but never was, Pierce Lewis, who was just the biggest devotee. And then I'll call names out, and then I got here, and people like John Western and Jim Duncan showed up, and they had very, very different ways, respectful, but very, very different ways of looking at the discipline. I'm not sure I was going to go with that, but I think that was very formative being here. But I feel like in many ways the historical geography part was above the fray, and Don was above the fray. On the third hand, can I have a third hand? What that signaled was a re-theorization of the discipline, and what came to be called the spatial turn outside the discipline. Right. So I think prior to the 70s, geographers, we were kind of a small group, mostly talking to each other and not being paid attention to by a lot of the other social sciences or the humanities. And I think suddenly the rest of the human sciences discovered space and place in the late 20th century, and suddenly we were a hot commodity. But if you think about Don's work, he was always doing that. And so when I say above the fray, I don't mean out of the conversation. I mean indifferent to it in many ways, because he was already writing these kind of... Now, the grand narrative part is a different question. I might come back to that. But he was already writing for what we now would call an interdisciplinary audience. And he was sort of Catholic with a small c, with his sources and with his ideas in ways that I think have come back in lots of ways. What was the thing I said I was going to come back to? Oh yeah, I can't remember. Oh, the grand narrative thing. Somebody hinted at this earlier. It was also at a time when, for social theoretical reasons, the grand narrative got a bad rap. Now, I did argue at the time, and I would argue that Don's version of the grand narrative was not the kind that was getting the grand rap. It was a particular kind of subject position that was particularly male-dominated and all kinds of and historically not inclusive in ways that told a particular version of the story. And Don's work never did that, I think. On the other hand, I think we dove into particularity so long that suddenly versions of narrative or the grand narrative are, if they're not trendy again, they're accepted in a new form. And so I think I just kind of see Don's work, and maybe some of what some of us do, is kind of engaging the fray but floating above it in many ways. And I think I thank this department for that, actually.
I think there's an interesting lesson for current graduate students. If you listen to what most of us have talked about, we've talked about Don's books. And there were 10 of them, and the quantity is important, but the quality is important as well. But what we have focused less on is the 40 articles, or 40 however many articles. And I think there's a really interesting lesson there in terms of the kinds of things that right now get you hired in a geography department and get you tenured are journal articles in high impact or journals. But and we know this, the kinds of publications that often have real longevity are books. And so I think for geography as a discipline, we kind of sit at this, we do both, right? So people write books, and that's great, but they also need to write articles, because articles are the things that carry more weight. And I think Don was always kind of threading that needle of finding ways to speak to his discipline, but then also saying, I am bored with only one conversation. I want to have this much bigger conversation that really took place through the books. And now, 50 years down the road, those are the things that we're talking about much more so than the Annals articles, which probably at the time everybody was talking about in that moment.
I just say about the department. One of the great things I remember along Rich's lines was the intellectual diversity that I experienced in the department. And the fact that I happened to be here, maybe you guys were too, when John Agnew, for example, was here, who became just a major figure in our discipline. He left Syracuse after a relatively short tenure here and went to UCLA. Spent much of the rest of his career there. And I was also here when one of Don's very best friends, David Sulfur, was here. He was a cultural geographer with the Berkeley connection and so forth. And that was just good timing, lucky timing, And the first person I walked into as a graduate student introduction to graduate studies was Mark Monmonier. And Mark, you were, the first day of class was Mark cracking jokes about something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but right. But so I guess what I'm saying is I really appreciated, although, Don mentored me, I was part of a community and a diverse community, at least in terms of ideas. Now it's a diverse community in much more diverse ways, which is a wonderful thing that's happened to our discipline. I remember going to AAG meetings when they were overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white European men. And that has changed, all for the good. And it has enriched our discipline in huge numbers of ways. So that's another thing I would say has changed about the department to the good and about the discipline. It's still a process. It's long going. But I sure have great memories of that intellectual diversity I experienced here.
I can't resist. Sorry, go ahead. I'll go
Hold that thought.
Okay. Give me your pen so I can hold it properly.
I was going to say, in terms of speaking to the graduate students and thinking about where historical geography is today and how that's changed, I think we are seeing a much smaller number of people who really profess to be historical geographers or make that their primary affiliation. But I think we see a lot of people across geography who are doing work that has some historical depth that is also geography. And so I think it's okay for that to be happening. But at the same time, some of those very same people, and this is the point of criticism, is I don't think they look back very far in the discipline. They don't draw, they're not trying to stand on the shoulders of those the Don Meinings who came before them. And I think that's a weakness. I think it's a positive trend that we're seeing more people doing retrospective longitudinal studies, whatever you want to call it, but they could, I think, improve their work and perhaps even the impact factor if they look back to see who talked about some of these things in maybe different ways before them.
Can you still hold?